Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Bas and in this video I'm going to show you how I knit socks on a single bed knitting machine. The machine I'm going to use is this knitting machine. This is my Singer Solo knitting machine. It is a flat bed knitting machine. It is a single bed knitting machine, so it has one needle bed. And it has a needle spacing of 9 millimeters, which makes it suitable for the thicker yarns most hand knitters use. And that's also why it is called a hand knitting machine. Okay, socks. So I've got an example of a sock here, also knitted on this machine by the way. And instantly when you look at the sock, you can see a sock is a tube. But a single bed knitting machine can only knit flat. So flat pieces of fabric. So what we're going to do is we're going to knit our sock as a flat piece of fabric and then afterwards sew it into a tube. Let me show you how I do it. And the pattern I'm going to use to knit my socks is this pattern. This is a pattern often used by machine knitters on a single bed knitting machine, and it's basically just a rectangle. You start with knitting the ribbing, then you continue knitting the leg. Then on one half side of the knitting you knit the heel in short rows, then you continue knitting the foot, and then again on half of the knitting on one side you knit the toe, and then you take the knitting off on waste yarn and you sew your sock together. And the yarn I'm going to use is this yarn. This is a 100% acrylic yarn, and on a ball of 100 grams there is 241 meters. And I've also got some leftover waste yarn in a thinner thickness from another project which I'm going to use for the cast on and the cast off. So this yarn is not officially sock yarn. Official sock yarns often have a percentage of polyamide in them to make the yarn stronger. Because socks, you walk on your feet all day, socks get a lot of wear and tear, so the yarn needs to be strong to prevent holes from forming. But in this case, these are quite thick socks. I only wear them indoors, inside. So I don't mind if they wear and tear a little bit sooner. And furthermore, I can just knit a new pair if I want, because I can knit it on my knitting machine just like that. And I have knitted many socks before on this machine and also with this yarn. So I know that on a stitch size of 6 on this machine, I get a gauge of 16.5 stitches and 26.5 rows on a 10 by 10 centimeter square. So for my foot size, I can calculate exactly how many stitches I need to set up and how many rows I need to knit. And first I'm going to wind my balls of yarn into yarn cakes to make feeding the yarn into the machine easier. So I take my ball winder and I mount it to the table. Now winding my balls of yarn into yarn cakes. My yarn cakes are done and now I'm going to cast on in waste yarn. I'm going to cast on as many stitches as I need for my rib, and in my case I need 36 stitches. So that is 18 stitches to the left side of 0. This is stitch 18 and 18 stitches to the right side of 0 and all needles in between. And I'm placing these needles in knitting position 2 and I'm checking that all the latches are open. Now I take my cast on comb and I add the metal bar and I extend it with another cast on comb so it covers all the needles in my knitting. I hang the cast on comb over the needles, click it into place. Now I take my waste yarn and place it on the floor. I set my stitch size to 3 and the needle selector switch is pressed to 1. I anchor my yarn in the yarn stopper on the right side of the machine. I lay my yarn into the needle hooks, slightly tension it on the left side and I take my carriage across. Now I can release the cast on comb from the machine. And I want to bring my needles back out again in knitting position 2 so I can lay in my yarn. So I take my carriage across, still in knitting position 1, so the needles that are in knitting position 1 stay in knitting position 1. I press the needle selector switch to 2, carriage across. So now all my needles are forward into knitting position 2. I check that all my needle latches are open, so my yarn is on the left side and my carriage is on the left side. And now I can knit about 3 to 5 rows of waste yarn. I'm going to knit the final row of waste yarn in the stitch size I'm going to use for my actual knitting. In this case, stitch size 6. I lay in my yarn and I take my carriage across. Okay, so the waste yarn knitting is done, so now I can start knitting with my main yarn. I'm going to release the yarn from the yarn stopper on the right, and you can knit any rib you like. You can do the mock rib, you can do the hand manipulated rib, and you can do the hand knitted rib. But depending on your preferences, I like my ribbing to be really stretchy, so I'm going to go with the hand manipulated rib. So I take my main yarn, I place it on the floor. I anchor it in the yarn stopper on the left side of the machine. And now I'm going to E-wrap all the needles. So I'm coming with my yarn from the bottom and I'm going up on the right side of the needle, down on the left. Next needle, up on the right side, down on the left. So basically I am making an E shape around all the needles. And keep it fairly loose. Now I am going to push the needles just slightly forward because I want my E-wrap to fall behind the needle latches, and I'm pushing my E-wrap behind the latches. Needles back into knitting position 2. So here is my E-wrap cast on, ready to go. And for the size of my sock in my gauge, I'm going to knit 14 rows for the ribbing. I reset my row counter to 0 and I'm going to set my stitch size to 3. I lay in my yarn in the needle hooks, checking that the latches are open, slightly tension it on the left side, and I take my carriage across. I'm going to release the yarn from the yarn stopper on the left. I'm going to hang my edge weights to help the edge stitches knit off more easily, and I continue knitting. Okay, row 13, so one more row to go, and for the final row I'm going to increase my stitch size to the size for the main knitting to 6, and I'm also going to press my needle selector switch to 1. This makes latching up the ribbing on the needles easier. Lay in the yarn, carriage across. 14 rows. I'm going to remove my edge weights. I'm going to take my latch hook tool. And now I'm going to latch up all the needles I want for my ribbing. And I want a 1x1 rib, which means I'm going to latch up every other needle. I'm going to start at the left side and I'm going to look very closely at the column of stitches. And I'm going to insert my latch hook tool just above the waste yarn. Now I'm going to drop the stitch and ladder it down. And the stitches on the edge are always a little bit difficult. Okay, let me show you what I've got here. So I've got one stitch on my latch hook tool behind the latch. And now I'm going to grab every bar above into the needle hook and pulling it through the stitch, making sure that the current stitch always slides behind the latch and I pick the next bar into the needle hook. And I continue like this for the entire column. And I place the stitch back onto the needle. Okay, so the first column of stitches is reformed. And I'm going to repeat this for every other needle. I place my ledge hook tool in the stitch above the waste yarn. I drop the stitch. I lather it down and I latch it up. And my final needle I'm going to leave as is. I'm not going to latch it up because I want that to be a normal stitch for sewing the seam together later. I'm rehanging my edge weights. The ribbing is finished, so now I'm going to continue knitting the leg in just plain knitting. And I'm going to knit 48 rows. To continue knitting the leg, first I need to bring out my needles again to knitting position number 2. So I'm going to pass the carriage still in knitting position 1, so the needles that are in knitting position 1 stay in knitting position 1. And now I'm going to press the switch to knitting position 2, so the needles that are in knitting position 1 will come forward to knitting position 2. So all my needles are forward again, the needle latches are open. I'm going to reset my row counter. My edge weights are on the machine. My stitch size is still on stitch size 6 and the needle selector switch is pressed to 2. So now I can knit 48 rows. And every so often I'm moving up my edge weights to keep tension on the edge needles. "48 rows, so now I have knitted the leg. And I'm going to start with the heel in short rows. And I'm going to knit the heel on the right side of the knitting. So I have 36 stitches, 18 to the left side of 0 and 18 to the right side of 0. So the 18 stitches to the left side of 0 I'm going to bring forward into holding position. So these needles will not knit if I pass the carriage. So I'm only knitting on these needles. And I'm going to short row the heel and I'm going to use a different color than the main color of the sock. You don't have to, you can continue in the same color, but I like the look of a different color. I'm going to anchor my orange yarn on the right side of the machine. I'm going to lay in my yarn in the needle hooks and I'm going to drop it in between the needles that are in work and that are in holding position. I'm going to take my carriage across. Now for short rowing the heel, every time you pass the carriage you place one needle on the opposite side of the carriage, in this case this needle, into holding position. So this needle will not knit. And for short rowing in, to prevent holes from forming in the sock, we're also going to wrap the needle. So the last needle on the side of the carriage that was put into holding position, we're going to wrap. And this means we're going to lay the yarn over that needle. So I'm coming up on the left side of that needle. I'm laying my yarn into the needle hooks and I'm dropping the yarn in between the needle that is in work and into holding position. And I take my carriage across. Same procedure on the opposite side of the carriage. I'm going to put one needle in holding position. So this needle now will not knit. And I'm going to wrap the needle on the side of the carriage. So wrap the yarn around that needle and drop it in between the needle that is into working position and in holding position. Carriage across. Again, on the opposite side of the carriage, one needle into holding position. Wrap the yarn around the last needle that was in holding position and drop it in between the needles that are in hold and into work. And you continue like that. Opposite side of the carriage into hold, wrap on the side of the carriage, drop it in between these needles. Into holding position, wrap around the last needle into hold and drop it in between. Holding position, wrap, drop it in between. And you continue with this until you have 6 needles left, about a third of the needles you have in total. So I have 80 needles and a third is 6 needles. I put one needle into hold, wrap the last needle, drop it in between. Into hold, wrap, drop. And this is a great machine that doesn't really need a lot of weight, but just to be sure I'm going to add one weight in the center here. One needle into hold, wrap the needle, drop it in between. Holding position, wrap, drop it in between. So, last needle into hold, wrap, drop it in between. So now I have 6 needles left. And now I'm going to short row out. And instead of placing a needle in holding position on the opposite side of the carriage, I'm now going to place a needle in working position on the opposite side of the carriage. So this needle I'm going to push back into working position. And I still have to wrap this needle from the last one I put into hold. So wrap, drop it in between the needles that are in hold and into work. Opposite side of the carriage, place one needle back into working position, and for short rowing out you do not have to wrap the needles. So I'm coming in between the needles that are in work and into hold, and I'm dropping it in between the needles that are in work and into hold. Into working position, in between, drop it in between, working position, in between, drop it in between. Okay, so now I have one more needle that I need to put into working position on the left side, and then all my 80 needles are back into work. But since this is my last needle, I'm going to continue knitting the entire sock. So I knitted the heel and now I'm going to continue knitting the foot. So I'm going to place all needles on the left side back into working position. I'm checking that all my needle latches are open, and they are. I'm anchoring my yarn on the right side. And now I'm going to take my green yarn again and lay it into the needle hooks. And for the foot I'm going to knit 56 rows. So I'm resetting my row counter. And knit 56 rows. Every so often placing my edge weights up to keep tension on the edge needles. Row 56, so I have finished knitting the foot and now I'm going to continue knitting the toe. And you knit the toe exactly the same as the heel. So short rowing on the right side of the knitting, exactly the same. So we are going to place the left needles in holding position. So needle 1 to 18 in holding position. And I'm going to knit the toe on the right side of my knitting. Again, I'm going to take my orange yarn. I lay my yarn into the needle hooks in between the needles that are in work and into hold. And I take my carriage across. I place the rightmost needle in hold and I wrap the needle on the side of my carriage. So I'm wrapping the needles for short rowing in. And I'm dropping my yarn in between the needle that is in work and into holding position. One needle in hold on the opposite side of the carriage, wrapping the last needle that was put into hold and dropping the yarn in between the needles that are in work and into hold. One needle holding position, wrap the yarn, drop in between. Holding position, wrap the yarn, drop in between. And I'm placing one edge weight in the middle of my heel. Holding position, wrap, drop. Holding position, wrap, drop. So now I have 6 needles left and I'm going to short row out. So the last needle that was put into hold, I'm now going to put back into working position on the opposite side of the carriage. I still need to wrap this needle, drop it in between, the needle opposite of the carriage into working position, and for short rowing out we do not need to wrap any more needles, so I'm coming up in between the needles that are in work and into holding position. And I'm also dropping the yarn in between the needles that are in work and holding position. Into work, in between, drop it in between, into work, in between, drop it in between. Carriage across. And the final needle on the left side in working position. So I need one more pass of the carriage to finish my toe, and I'm also going to knit these needles. So I'm going to place the needles back into working position, check that all my latches are open, and a few have closed, so I'm opening them now. So all my latches are open. And you can choose the orange yarn or the green one for your final pass. It doesn't matter. I am going to choose orange today. And my sock is finished. And now I'm going to take my work off from the machine on waste yarn. So I'm going to knit about 5 to 10 rows. Remove the edge weights, take the carriage across without any yarn, and the knitting will be released from the machine. I release my knitting from the cast on comb, and here is our first sock. And we're finished. I took off the knitting on waste yarn, so we have knitted an entire sock as a rectangle. Now we need to knit a second sock. And because this sock has a seam on one side, I want my socks to be mirrored. So for the second sock, I'm going to knit exactly this pattern, but mirrored. So I'm going to knit the heel on the left side, and I'm also going to knit the toe on the left side. And to knit the second sock mirrored is actually quite easy. My first sock I started with my carriage on the right. So for my second sock, I'm going to start with my carriage on the left. And I knit everything the same way as I did for my first sock, but mirrored. And that's great gymnastics for your brain. Keeps you sharp. And here are my socks. So we've knitted the ribbing, then we knitted the leg, we knitted the heel on half of the knitting on the right and on half of the knitting on the left. Then we knitted the foot and we knitted the toe on half of the knitting on the right and on half of the knitting on the left. And then we took the work off on waste yarn. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to remove the waste yarn from the ribbing. Then I'm going to sew up the toe with the Kitchener stitch. And then I'm going to seam the sock all along the length with a mattress stitch. And another pair of knitted socks. Super easy to knit on this single bed flatbed knitting machine. And remember, you can knit the socks in any color you like. You don't have to use two colors. You can knit them in one color, or you can use all the colors of the rainbow. Go wild! I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please leave a like on the video, comment down below, subscribe to the channel. It all helps out the channel a lot. You know the drill. Thanks. I wish you happy knitting and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!